Tell us how you got into electronics and tube design.
Well, my father had a radio and TV repair shop in Indiana, where I grew up, and I worked with him for quite a few years. And this was back in the era of vacuum tubes. It was before solid state came along. And I repaired TVs and radios and hi-fis and all of that, so I was very familiar with vacuum tubes.
Did Dad teach you a lot of his electronic knowledge? Did he pass that on to you?
Well, he did. He taught me a lot, but then again, it was a little frustrating for me because sometimes I would ask him questions and he wouldn't answer, and he says, well, I want you to figure that out for yourself, because that's what he had done in his life, and he wanted me to learn to do the same thing. So as frustrated as it was, I would plow along and play around with the stuff and figure it out myself. It turns out this was a blessing in disguise, because this is how I've done my design work all these years. Well, my first work was in radio control. I was a model hobbyist, and I used to fly control line model airplanes. And I saw a fellow by the name of Vernon C. McNabb, who had an audio company in Indianapolis, where I grew up. He was flying a very early radio control model with rudder-only control and vacuum tube radio. And I was so impressed with that I decided to get into radio control. Well, at the time, it was very primitive. We used hearing aid batteries and small vacuum tubes and little rubber band escapements to control the control surfaces. So I worked on those designs and built quite a few of them from articles that I saw published in different magazines. And finally got to where I could reliably fly some of those models. This was the last transmitter that I built in Indianapolis before I moved to California. It was a ground-based transmitter that put out 25 watts. At that time, the receivers were not very sensitive, so we had to use a lot of transmitter power. This one had a 9-foot antenna on it. There was a plug here that the box that you control the model with plugged into that had rudder and elevator and throttle control on it. Did a lot of radio control design, which is a lot more comprehensive than you would believe, because it's a very high performance receiver and a transmitter and a servo, and it's all got to be miniaturized, and it has to be very rugged because it is encountering a very rugged environment of high vibration from the engine and so forth. So I left DK Products and then formed my own company a few years later called Proline, and there we were making the best radio control system, I think, in the world at that time. That was back in the 70s. We used 4 IFs. Most people at the time were using 3, so we had more selectivity. We're using a tuned RF amplifier, which most people weren't using, and I used a sweep generator to optimize the 2 RF coils to get a very narrow bandwidth. So with the FET front end and the very narrow bandwidth, we really have excellent image rejection, and didn't have any problem with overload and things like that were plaguing a lot of the other radios. So you could take one of these things out to the field where other people were crashing, and you could just fly it right over another antenna, like a AM radio antenna or something like that, and it wouldn't even phase it. We were doing well with this product until the Japanese entered the radio control market. And they were taking products and virtually copying them and entering the U.S. with them at lower prices that we could not compete with. In fact, one of my competitors, it was a Kraft radio system, and the fellow that owned the business was Phil Kraft. I remember talking to him one day. He said he looked at one of the copies of his radios coming out of China. They copied the circuit board exact, even the mistakes and the errors that were in it. They copied everything because they didn't know any better. because they weren't able to design one. So after a year or so of that, the market went down, and we could not sell enough volume to make any money. In the later days of Proline, I met a fellow named Fred Hewlin in Kansas City, and he had an audio store. And he invited me to stop by sometime, and on one of my trips to Chicago, I stopped there and spent some time with him, and he took me into his audio store. And he had the most amazing audio system that I had ever seen. And he had an Altec Acousti-Voice equalizer. It was a 3rd octave band equalizer that he was using for rim correction. And I looked at the equalizer, the way it was adjusted, and I could see the general curve that it followed. And I asked him, I said, do you think there might be a market for an equalizer that would follow this curve that would be much less expensive than the Altec equalizer? And he said, sure. So when I got home, I started breadboarding up an audio equalizer. And that's where I came up with my first patent that became used in the Rockford Fosgate power punch amplifiers. This is one of the first 5 prototypes that we built. It had adjustable high and low EQ. You can see that that was born and bred from the frequency energizer. This was basically the same frequency responses as that was. That's what it looks like inside. It was pretty compact. Had a huge heatsink on the bottom. It has the same circuit as the frequency energizer here on the front board. Then we had the power amp in here. This one doesn't have any graphics on it. This was the first prototype. The other one was a PR7000. This is a PR3500. And it basically had the same equalizer circuit, only fixed, just like we had over here on the frequency energizer. And it had a power inverter and a power amp in it. And it had auto switching. What it did, it sensed audio and turned itself on and off. So it was very easy for an installer to install. He just put this in the car, hooked it up to 12 volts, ran the speaker leads out, ran the audio source into it, and whenever they turned the radio on, this would turn on. So it was the first product like that that I know of in the car stereo business. This is the third product. It was mated with this power amplifier, 100 watts per channel. This was the preamp control head, and this was the power amp. So they were, at first they were in one piece, and this is when we separated them into 2 separate pieces. So the circuitry that you saw in the frequency energizer and in that other board is all built in here. This is all the equalizer and volume control. The next Fosgate piece was basically 2 of these. It was biamped, and this was the control head for it. Had high frequency, low frequency EQ, and it also had a mid frequency to take the mid bass down, which was a problem in a lot of cars. They had way too much mid bass. Well, we had gone about as far as I thought we could with car stereo. We had very good sounding amplifiers and equalizers and all of that. So I was looking for the next horizon for auto sound, and I thought surround sound would be the way to go. So I auditioned a couple of different systems in a car. Time delays were popular at that time. This was right at the end of quadraphonic era. And I didn't like that very much. And I got hold of a tape decoder from Wes Ruggles, one of 2 or 3 prototypes that he had. And I put a power converter in my car. I drove over to California to Wes's place, and we put his tape decoder in the trunk, and we listened to it in the car. And I was very impressed with it, and I thought, well, this is the way to go. Okay, well, this is the Tetra that we talked about earlier. and we demonstrated it in the car, but it never did get into production because we sold the company and eventually became Rockford Fosgate, and of course they weren't interested in this product, and it wasn't really ready for production anyway. So I took about a year off and then decided to take that technology and build a product for the home with it, because I saw a lot of potential there. This was basically that same circuit that we just showed you in the Tetrasound. This was in the home product called the Tate 101. And inside we had the control voltage generator that we had designed, and we encapsulated it in epoxy filled with sand, so it made it very difficult for anybody to understand what we had done. We were trying to protect ourselves a little bit. We manufactured these just 1 or 2 a week and sold them through 2 different magazines that were catering to quadraphonic listeners. And we advertised in those, and of course they were helping us push this. That basically kept us alive for that first year. After that, we came out with the Model 101A, and it was cleaned up and simpler to make, did not have the encapsulated circuit inside. Here's one of them here. This was the Tate 101A, and it is quite a different layout. Now, this is one of our production units, and we used it to grade the Tate ICs. You can see there's a plug-in IC holder for the Tate ICs. Very easy to put one in and take it out. We had to grade these Tate ICs. Some of them were unusable, and then some of them were better than others. And we graded them into 3 categories that were usable. There was the B, which was the standard one. There was an A, which was a little better one. Then there was a double A, which was the very best one. We saw very, very few double A's. And on the back, if you look at the serial number on one, the last number is either a B, an A, or a double A. That'll tell you the grading of those ICs. I don't think anyone is aware of that, but if you see a double A, it's one of the best, and you won't see very many. The 101A had 3 different listening modes. It had SQ, Cinema, and Surround. Now in the SQ mode, what it was doing was decoding SQ as it was encoded into 4 separate channels. When we went into Cinema, we were keeping the left and right front up in the front, and we were putting the Dolby Surround in the rear, and we were also increasing the time constant so it was a little more stable on Dolby ProLogic encoded material. Surround was used for stereo material and making it wrap around the room. It would take a stereo signal and wrap it around the room around 270 degrees, make it real big. In this mode here, the left channel in the stereo mix would be on the left back channel. The signal that was on the right channel would be in the right back channel. Things that were in the left plus right, which would be the mono center front, would still be in the front, and everything else would be wrapped around in about a 270 degree arc. This was the unit, the Model 101A, that we took to the trade show and had total opposite results that we did with the Model 101, where we didn't get any orders at all. We were a smashing success. We were in a small room. We were running tube amplifiers. It was so hot in there, you could hardly breathe. And we had borrowed a Klaus projection TV 6-foot screen, and we're using Laserdisc. They were showing music videos and movie soundtracks. And I'm not kidding you, we just blew everybody away. They could not believe what they were seeing and what they were hearing. And that trade show is what led to getting a Hi-Fi Grand Prix Award in 1982. This was the unit that we showed at later trade shows of the Model 101A. We had problems obtaining the custom ICs to build the Tate 2. In fact, the last 50 units that we built, we had them all ready to plug those in and ship them, and we're unable to buy the ICs. They were just not available. Dolby were also using those in some of their cinema processors, and they had the same problem. They couldn't get them either. So to stay in business, we had to find another technology. And I had run into a man named Peter Schreiber at one of the trade shows that we hit it off very well together. And he is the original inventor of matrix surround sound with the first patent on that was licensed by CBS. And also the Tate system fell under that patent as well. So Pete had his own little pet circuit that he had designed, and he had a working breadboard, and he came to my house here in Heber with it, and we listened to it, and it especially did a very good job on movie soundtracks, which at that time were just beginning to take off. So we decided to go for it. This was the first product that we made together. I designed everything, including the steering logic. Pete had done the matrixing and VCAs and a lot of that stuff, but I did the controllers generator because I had a lot of experience with the Tate system. So this was it. It was primarily intended for movies, although it did a fairly good job with stereo. It wasn't as dramatic as the SQ was, but it was very smooth and very stable and did a real good job. And you can see it had input level controls, had surround sensitivity. We had a bass equalizer built into it. The surround sensitivity was a level on the surround channel. In other words, you could bring the backs up and down wherever you liked it. There was a light that would light when something was encoded in the backs and the surround on Dolby Pro Logic. It was helpful because when you were playing a lot of stereo material, you never knew exactly what the balance was going to end up after it went through the processor, so you could adjust that to your liking, whether you wanted a little more or a little less in the back. This was the next product that we built. We were using the patented bass EQ circuit that we had in the car. We included it in here because we figured it was a selling point. Now this one had built-in power amplifiers. I used some of my technology that I had learned in the Rockford car stereo business and built a power amp inside. This was a good selling feature because a person could buy this processor and just add 2 back speakers, and they didn't have to buy another amplifier. This was a 3606. It had adjustable stage width controls. You could go medium, wide, regular, and so forth, and center front on and off. We could run the logic on and off. You could run it off for like classical music. It would be very stable. There would be nothing happening to the signal. The next one in the series was the 3608. It was fairly similar to the first one there, to the last one I mean, but it had improved sonics. We kept working with the control voltage generators inside and kept evolving to a little bit better circuitry and better sound, more separation, and more stable. So each generation got a little better than the previous one. This one differs from the others in that it did have a remote control. and had a built-in time delay. This was what they call a bucket brigade, which was the early method of doing time delay. So each generation, you can see it was getting closer and closer to what we have now in Dolby Pro Logic and Dolby Pro Logic 2. This was the last unit in the space matrix that we designed and manufactured. And at this point, Peter and I were working together on these products, and we started to disagree on which way to go with the steering logic. He was ready to go with phase detectors, and I wanted to stay with log ratio detectors, and I wanted to go with variable speed, and he wanted to keep going with fast attack and slow decay. So we decided to go our different directions, and we went away from the space matrix into our own designs, which use front, back, and left-right sensing in the logic system. Wider and narrower. It had several different modes: Popular 1, Popular 2, Popular 3, Motion Picture 1, Motion Picture 2, Classical 1, Classical 2. Now, each one of these modes changed the steering logic to optimize it for those particular types of program material. And it had a calibrate control over here, which was used to set signal level. Has a center channel for, on and off. Now, we had no center channel on the earlier space matrices. Okay, here's our Model 2. There were significant differences between the Model 1 and all of the space matrices that we did. The main thing was this one had front-back logic sensing, but it also had left-right logic sensing. This is the first one where we put the logic display on that. The people that worked for me called it the Fosgometer, so that name kind of stuck. When you look at these lights and you watch a program, it will show you which direction the dominant signal is in the sound stage. And it's pretty interesting to watch it because you can tell a lot about the program source, and you can see if you've got it out of bounds or something like that. It has an input balance control on it. And if, for instance, I was playing a thing with a center front vocalist on it, the light would light at the top, which means that's the center. If I would turn the input balance to the left or to the right, it would shift to the different directions there. And this one also had a noise sequencer built into it so that it helped set up your levels in your room. You just hit the button. And these are, of course, features that are in modern-day surround processors. This is the first one we were actually able to call it Dolby Pro Logic. So we have that on this one. We also have Movie Surround, which was our own movie mode, and the other one was Dolby's mode. We found by this time the consumer really wanted to have a Dolby button just for security, to know that it was exactly the way it should be to decode Dolby, so we put them on every model from here on. And it had 2 classical positions. Also, another new thing it had is mono enhance. We have a patent on that. It had a pair of phase shifters, and it was a very interesting way to process mono. Okay, the mono enhance is there so that we can play music that's recorded in mono and spread it around the room and make it sound fairly close to surround sound. So what the circuit did, it would first mono the signal. It would take the left and right and mono that to just one output. Then that would be fed into the dual phase shifter circuit that would spread the channel phase-wise, especially through the mid-range. Then this circuit would be fed into the input of the surround processor. So then the processor would process that, and the result was a pretty spacious sound field that would be all over the room. This is the Model 4, which has front, back, and left, right logic sense. And here we had a logic display with two back corners. Boost would bring the center front level up 3 dB. There used to be some controversy where that level should be, and we always felt like it should be 3 dB higher than Dolby did, so we had to build it both ways to get the Dolby name on it. This also used the time link for time delay in there. 70 millimeter was a different movie mode, and it was our own mode, and we put that name on it, as well as the Pro Logic. The 70 millimeter would have had more separation and faster time constants. The Pro Logic mode had to be slowed down so that it was very similar to Dolby's own Pro Logic. And this was our own circuit, and the only one I know of that Dolby ever licensed to use the word Pro Logic on our own circuit. Okay, the next one in the series was the Model 5. This was essentially a stripped down version of the Model 4. It was remote controlled. It had 5 different time delays, 45 milliseconds, 30, 25, 20, 15. I always thought this was one of my favorite ones because it sounded as good as that one, but it was much less expensive to make. You can see it was very simple, very clean circuit. Here's the next one that we did, and this one is called the Model 3, which is actually was built after the Model 5, and I don't remember the reason why we call it number 3 right now, but we did. This one is the first one that we designed and manufactured after the company was sold to Harman International. This one has THX on it, and believe me, that was very hard to get. THX people were at that time very difficult to work with, and they wrote a book on the specifications of what they wanted. You could walk in the door with something that met those specs, and they might decide to rewrite the specs on you, and you'd have to go home and redesign it. And the story was you never went into THX twice with the same product, but if you went in the second time, it would probably flunk because they wanted it different. But anyway, we finally got it approved, and this one had sibilant filter built into it, a re-equalizer. What the re-EQ was is a circuit that THX wanted in the surround channels. They were trying to duplicate the sound that you would get in their mixing studio at home. So they mic'd their surround channel to see what it looked like, and they made you put an EQ filter in the back to get that. And they also had a few other tricks in the surround channel to try to spread it and make it sound bigger, because it was actually just a mono signal fed to the surrounds. This one was a very popular processor, and it was nearly the end of the designs of the logic steering before we went into Dolby Pro Logic 2. After I developed the 6-axis, this was my final design in that type of circuitry. This actually started with a 6-axis board and had a lot of modifications on it. It turns out that it was very simple, actually, compared to a 6-axis. You can see on the board the parts that have been removed and how few were left over here. This is the logic section over here on this board. This never got into production. I was working with Harman's automotive division, called Harman Motive in Indiana. And we did a lot of work together on surround sound. We had orders from BMW, and we had a very good sounding processor in the car. I designed a small board for it and was all ready to put it together, waiting for it to come in the door. And the day it came in, I get a phone call from Harman, and they fired me. So that little board and this circuit never saw the light of day. This one's been sitting on my shelf ever since. I auditioned it the other day, and the thing sounds almost as good as Pro Logic 2. It's awfully good. Let me explain what steering logic is. It's a method of increasing channel separation. The circuit works this way. We take the two channels, the original channels, and we use a matrix, and we mix that up to 5 output channels. Now we start out with infinite separation between the stereo signal, but when we mix it up to 5 channels, we no longer have perfect separation between each channel. What we have to do is analyze what the separation is in this matrix. And then we have what we call logic steering circuits that we use to increase the separation. And here's how they work. There's a signal detector in the front, back, and left-right axis that measures the dominant signal in real time that's happening in the sound stage. This signal then is controlling a voltage-controlled amplifier in each axis. Actually, there's 4 of them. One for the front, one for the back, one for the left, one for the right. These signals send in out-of-phase signals into the matrix to cancel the crosstalk. So if everything works right, the detector is seeing these signals, the detector is telling the fully controlled amp how much level to have, then that is feeding into the matrix and it's canceling the signal right out. We can get about 40 dB. It, of course, is a little less when the music's running, but probably makes 30, 35 then.